Natalie is Director of Practice and Development at the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy. Natalie and I have worked a long time. We did a lot of work together in the European region about evidence-based practice, about the development of clinical practice guidelines. And at a certain point, you moved from your clinical position to the policy position at the Chartered Society, working on evidence-based practice from the societal input and getting those activities out from the Chartered Society into the daily practice of clinicians in the UK. And I look very much forward to hearing your presentation. Would you like this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip. You will see from my short presentation, I'm going to be covering a particular type of briefing that we've developed over several years, which looks at the effectiveness of physiotherapy in certain areas. These are not clinical guidelines, but use of evidence in a different format for maybe a different purpose. I've got too many things to hold here. So do I? Okay, thank you, Femke. So in terms of the purpose, these briefings were designed by us to facilitate conversations between physiotherapists and decision makers in health. So they were not necessarily for them to use in their own practice, but a way by which a physiotherapist had a short and concise briefing underpinned by evidence that then they could discuss with commissioners of services, whether that be at government level, whether that be at a regional level or a local level. So that's what they are focused on. And you will see each of the slides I've covered one of the areas of the briefings that we have developed over time. And if we go to the next one, Femke, thank you. This first one this one's from last year and is an update of an original on COPD. Next slide, please. The most important thing about the development is topic selection. And before you set off, what we found we needed to do is to have some criteria against which we were going to judge areas of practice that we could develop a briefing of the clinical and cost effectiveness of physiotherapy on. So obviously very important, we had to have sufficient evidence for a particular topic area, and that included economic evidence. We also highlighted in the criteria whether it was a government policy area. Because if we can meet the needs of government policies, we were much more likely to have funding for those services. And sometimes the priorities are international. So if we've got evidence from WHO, that was another reason why we would actually select that topic. They could be identified by individual members, maybe in professional networks. They could be a public health priority. So it is important that you do agree what your criteria are for topic selection at the beginning of the process. When I look back, I realised that we first started developing these in 2010. So it's taken us 10 years to get to the number of, I think, 18 briefings that we have to date. So the next slide, please. So the development, the most important thing that we found once we'd got the topic selected is agreeing a format for the target population. And when you see these series, they are very, very similar. So when we started off, they were only 2 sides of A4. They had relevant full colour images. They used a combination of hard-hitting statistics and facts, and the economic and financial benefits stand out very clearly in the briefing. We also, on the reverse side of the front, always included a case study of service innovation, which brought the briefing to life. You know, this is what it's really like in practice. And people reported that they like to have somewhere where they could refer to say, I noticed that you have tried this model of care from this briefing, and to have their facts and their figures reinforce the importance of the actual briefing. Next slide, please. So in the further development, once we've got the topic audience selection, and I've already said this is for decision makers, we got a group of people together which comprise a number of people, because this is not something that one person can do sitting in a room on their own. This takes quite a team of people to develop over a period of time. Critical are people like librarians and the people that are going to undertake the literature review and the search. But we also included our design team, because they are going to help us actually ensure that we have got a format that we can fit into the area and that the text is appropriate for the target audience. We included our experts from professional networks as well as researchers. And then we went through a process of, once we had the literature review and the evidence, we then developed a first draft. It would have then gone out for comment and to be critiqued, and then develop a second draft. We would refer it to a health economist, and if anybody wants to know more about QALYs, I think Michael Brennan's far more experienced to discuss that with rather than me, but they were all assessed in terms of the additional sort of QALYs in terms of, and related to cost, that Michael discussed in his opening plenary discussion. So that is part of what they're there for, is to demonstrate not just the quality, but also the cost effectiveness of physiotherapy versus no interventions. Next slide, please. So dissemination. This is really the most difficult part, and this is the thing that you need to agree at the beginning of the process as well as your topic. So alongside your topic and your team involvement, you have a plan of how you're going to disseminate it. Now, you may have got a specific conference at which you wish to launch this, so then you would actually work back, but otherwise you decide on how you're going to disseminate it. At the moment, we are moving away from a hard copy print runs to print on demand. So you'll be able to go onto the CSP website and look at these briefings and then just download what you would like. The importance of having your professional networks, or a network of whether it's researchers or people that actually are passionate about the dissemination of evidence into practice, is critical. The CSP has got a number of professional networks, sometimes I think far too many. We've got over 30, and some of them are based around populations, so older people, children and young people, working age population. But some of them are about the different medical specialties, for example, neurology, musculoskeletal, and a range of areas like that. But some we have on specific techniques, so they are much, much smaller. Except for acupuncture, which is our largest professional network with over 6,000 members. But they all help with the dissemination of the evidence. Next slide, please. So I've reflected back on the learning from our start of this some 8 years ago. And the most important things were agreeing your criteria for the selection of the topics you want. Agreeing your target audience, who are they aimed at? And making sure that the format for that resource fits your target audience. The engagement of all stakeholders cannot be underemphasized. It is critical you get all the players together from the start. A challenge, and we have had those, that there are areas of physiotherapy practice where the evidence is very, very slim, and as a result we may not have briefings in those areas. So I think that's really interesting. It highlights gaps in the evidence base. The importance of utilising a range of professionals. The health economist has been critical to these, but so too has designers and writers in helping us make sure that the publications are fit for purpose. And finally, I think ensuring you give yourself a reasonable time frame. Our time frame for one of these is between 5 and 6 months to make sure that we go through the agreed robust process and before launch. So we've got, most recently, we've updated the one on stroke. If you go to the next slide, please. And then we've got one update coming out in the next couple of months on frailty. But once you've got a series of these, of course, then you need another process, learning, to make sure they're up to date. Because it's no good just leaving them there, languishing on the website. They do need to be reviewed between every 3 and 5 years. We have set our target at to ensure that we make it's evident that actually we've used the most up-to-date Cochrane reviews and any other systematic reviews that have come to light since we last made the actual briefings. And the final one, slide please. I think our conclusion is that physiotherapy does work for many populations, and you need to decide on the type of resource you need for your countries and your MOs and your members. But we have found that these have been disseminated right across the UK and been one of the most popular resources that we've ever developed. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it shows a very nice example of how to summarize the current knowledge, the state of the art, as well as the economic value and practice applications of these topics in 2 pages. So I think that's quite an effort to get it all done on a 2-page document. So thank you very much for presenting that to us. We have time for a couple of questions. I think the best thing is that I probably would walk around with the microphone. I see 1, 2 hands coming up, and then I get the microphone back. So this will be an exercise for me, but that's good for me. Do we have an extra microphone there? No, but we'll work it out.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you. That was a fantastic trip through Physiotherapy Works. I was just interested, 5 to 6 months seems a very short time to me. Did you, when you started these with the first one, I mean, have you obviously got better at it as you went along? And how long did it take for the first one?
I think the first ones actually were shorter because we were putting in quite a lot of resource intensively into the first couple of months to do the review of the literature and then summarise it and then start asking for it to be written up. What we've learnt now that because there are so many players, you can start some things at the same time. So the designer can look at the format, think about imagery, and then we actually need to agree quite early on in terms of the synopsis, what the key statistics might be, what are the hard-hitting numbers that people will want to see. So they can start playing with the page, if you see what I mean, from a design perspective. And then what takes the time is actually the liaison with your experts and the time that they've got free, because this is being done often. My team obviously are paid to do the work, but for a lot of our experts in practice, that means that's voluntary time. So that's why we give over the most time for them, and then it comes together then very quickly.
Thank you. And 1 second question.
Thank you, Natalie, for your presentation. Thank you very much. Do you have any feedback about the acceptance and the application and for effectiveness of this? Yep.
They've been, where we've had the greatest impact is where we've taken these particularly to GP conferences. And the biggest impact is GPs being made aware that physiotherapists have a much broader scope of practice and where they can be impactful than just back pain. And it has opened the eyes of GPs to the physiotherapist role, particularly with older people, particularly with frailty and dealing with people in primary care. And the one that is that GPs were amazed at was actually incontinence. They had no idea that exercise could help. So that on its own opened the eyes of people in primary care that physiotherapist is part of your team can make a massive difference. And I suppose looking forward now where we are today, it's because of we really focused on communicating with GPs about what we can do, not just in the musculoskeletal field, but in other areas, that not only now are we progressing with first contact physiotherapy in GP practices across the UK, and it is across the UK, across all 4 countries. They are now looking for physiotherapists to lead and lead on the implementation of packages of care and exercise for frailty and older people. So I think these were a starting point, but they also, from our members' point of view, they gave them the confidence to almost practice, I know all these facts, and to actually present it to their health boards, to their partners, to their stakeholders. So I think they've had quite a number of impacts over the period of time. So I think that's what we would say. What we would like to do, it'll be a great piece I'm going to suggest to one of my newer members of staff, to do a full sort of qualitative piece, maybe for WCPT in 2 years' time, so we can actually present, so how far was the impact and what's the reach. So we might better come back to you with an abstract couple of years' time.
Okay, and one final question, and then we go on to the next presenter.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Patricia from Portugal. From your experience, did you also reach entities like government and healthcare policymakers? And what was then the reception and the impact of this action?
The answer is yes. So in some of the evidence now is so strong that it is actually part of what we call NICE guidelines. So the COPD, they said we don't need any more evidence that COPD doesn't need physiotherapy because the evidence is so strong, we do not need any further research. We know that exercise programs for CPD absolutely are required and make a difference. Stroke is another area where we've had particular impact, and we have been working with the Stroke Association in the UK to raise the awareness of the lack of rehabilitation once people leave hospital. So we've got fantastic standards now for hospital-based care when people come in, but when they leave hospital, they fall off the cliff. And the government now is very aware, so the National Director for Stroke is focusing on making sure that we get rehabilitation for stroke in primary care following hospital admission. The other area is in hip fracture, work which we've led through these briefings and then into a full audit of hip fracture rehabilitation has identified the same thing. If they do get good hospital care, because we've got what was called a national hip fracture database, so we capture all that, when they leave hospital again, it goes off. And so the government is now focusing on rehabilitation for that particular cohort because that makes a difference in terms of decreased mortality. So we know if we can see people quickly and continue to see them, they need decreased care costs as well as actually they will still be living at a year post-hip fracture. So these are big figures, they're shocking. I think it's the one that really shocked me that, so somebody of my age, over 50, I know I don't look it, there's more chance of me actually breaking my hip than getting breast cancer. And I've had breast cancer, so how scary is that? So these big figures, these shocking stats are very powerful for us all to use, that some things are really, really important and the evidence absolutely backs it up about what we should be doing.
Thank you very much for your examples and clarification. And I believe that some other members of WCPT have also used your model to adopt these for their own country. So if you're interested in doing this in your own country, you can contact Natalie to see what it takes to get it done.